The rain fell over Ashworth Hall in long silver threads, and beneath the dripping eaves of the east portico, Eleanor Ashworth stood facing the man who had once promised to build his entire life around her name. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, distant and low, like a warning arriving too late to matter. The Duke of Rothmere stood a pace away, his greatcoat dark with rain, his jaw set in the particular hardness of a man who believed he was still in control of the moment. He did not yet understand that he was not. Eleanor's hands were folded before her, steady, in a way that surprised even herself, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not shake. "You are asking me to become a woman I do not recognize," she said. "I will not do it. Not for you, not for anyone." The Duke's expression flickered, disbelief giving way to something colder. "Then you choose them," he said. "You choose your father's ruin over the future I am offering you." "I choose neither," Eleanor answered. "I am not a piece to be placed on one side of a scale or the other." And then, before the thunder could answer for him, she turned and walked into the rain, leaving the Duke of Rothmere standing alone beneath the portico, with his ultimatum dissolving uselessly in the wet air behind her. What no one watching that scene could have known, not the Duke, not the servants pretending not to watch from the windows, not even Eleanor herself in that first trembling moment, was that this single act of quiet defiance would unravel a secret buried for 11 years, a secret that would eventually bring an entire estate to its knees and reveal a betrayal so old it had calcified into truth. But that revelation was still many months away. To understand how a penniless gentleman's daughter came to stand in the rain and refuse a duke, we must go back to the beginning, to a colder season and a much quieter kind of desperation. If this story moves you, if you find yourself leaning forward the way I did when I first heard it told, consider subscribing, because there are turns ahead that even careful readers will not see coming. Now, let us return to where it all began. It began 3 years earlier, in a modest stone house on the edge of Marlow Fen, where Eleanor Ashworth had grown accustomed to counting candles before counting hours. Her father, Sir Reginald Ashworth, had once held a respectable name in the county, a name attached to good land and better harvests, but a series of failed investments and one particularly cruel winter had reduced the family's fortune to a shadow of its former self. Eleanor did not resent her father for this. She resented, instead, the way society seemed to require her to apologize for it, as though poverty were a moral failing rather than simply bad luck arriving at an inconvenient door. She had learned, early, to hold her chin level, regardless of what her hem revealed, and to speak with the same composure, whether addressing a baron or a baker. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, leaving behind a younger brother, Thomas, whose lungs had never been strong, and a household that ran increasingly on Eleanor's quiet management rather than her father's diminishing attention. Sir Reginald was not a cruel man, only a defeated one, and defeat has a way of hollowing out even the kindest fathers. He spent his days writing letters to men who no longer answered them, and his evenings staring into a fire that grew smaller each month as coal became a luxury they could not always afford. It was Eleanor who mended the household's dignity from the inside, stitching pride into curtains that had grown thin, teaching Thomas his letters by firelight, learning to make a single joint of meat stretch across 4 days without anyone at market suspecting how carefully it had been rationed. It was at the Michaelmas Assembly in the nearby town of Hollowmere that Eleanor first encountered the Duke of Rothmere, though she did not know his title at the time, only that he stood taller than most men in the room, and watched the dancing with the detached patience of someone accustomed to being watched in return. He was newly arrived to the county, having inherited the vast Rothmere estate from an uncle he barely knew, and the entire assembly buzzed with speculation about his fortune, his temperament, and, most urgently, his marital availability. Eleanor had no interest in joining that speculation. She had come to the assembly only because Thomas had begged to see the musicians, and she stood near the refreshment table with the quiet invisibility of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting to be noticed by men of consequence. Which was precisely why she was so unprepared when the Duke approached her directly. bypassing 3 eligible young ladies who had spent the better part of an hour arranging themselves in his eye line. "You are the only person in this room," he said, without preamble, "who has not once looked toward me." Eleanor met his gaze evenly. Perhaps I did not realize I was required to. Something shifted behind his eyes, surprise, and beneath it, an unmistakable flicker of interest. "No," he said slowly, "I don't suppose you were." It was a small exchange, barely 30 seconds of conversation, and yet it planted something that would grow over the following months into an entanglement neither of them fully anticipated. The Duke, whose given name she would later learn was Alistair Vane, began finding reasons to appear wherever Eleanor happened to be. He called upon her father under the pretense of discussing land boundaries. He arranged to be present at the village church on Sundays, standing near enough to the Ashworth pew that his presence became impossible to ignore. Sir Reginald, ever hopeful for a reversal of fortune, encouraged the acquaintance with an eagerness that embarrassed Eleanor, though she said nothing, understanding the desperation beneath her father's enthusiasm. What Eleanor did not yet understand, what none of them understood, was that Alistair Vane's interest in the Ashworth family was not so simple as attraction alone. There was history buried in that connection, history that stretched back before Eleanor was born, tangled into the very reason the Ashworth fortune had collapsed in the first place. But that thread would not surface for a long while yet, and for now, all Eleanor knew was that a duke had begun to court her with a seriousness that unsettled even as it flattered. By the following spring, the courtship had become the subject of open gossip throughout the county, and Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to Alistair despite her own careful resistance. He was not, she discovered, the cold and calculating aristocrat his reputation suggested. In private moments, walking the perimeter of Rothmere's gardens, or sitting across from her during rare unchaperoned minutes when Thomas fell asleep by the fire, he spoke with an unexpected vulnerability, confessing his own uncertainties about the responsibilities he had inherited, the tenants who depended on decisions he did not yet feel qualified to make, the loneliness of a title that arrived without warning and without instruction. Eleanor found herself listening not as a woman calculating her own advancement, but as someone genuinely moved by the man beneath the rank. "You are the only person who speaks to me as though I might be wrong," Alistair told her one evening, as the sun folded itself behind the western hedgerows. "Everyone else agrees with me before I have even finished a sentence." "That is not admiration," Eleanor said. "That is fear, dressed as manners." He laughed, a genuine, startled laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted her. "Then I hope you will go on disagreeing with me for a very long time." It was, in its own quiet way, the closest thing to a declaration either of them had yet spoken aloud, and Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since her mother's death, to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of careful rationing and quiet endurance. But even as that hope took root, a shadow moved at the edges of the story, one neither Eleanor nor Alistair could yet see. In the Rothmere household, among the older servants who remembered the previous duke, there were whispers that grew louder the longer Eleanor's name was spoken in connection with the estate. Whispers about a woman named Marguerite Ashworth, Eleanor's own aunt, dead now for over a decade, and a scandal so carefully buried that even Eleanor herself had never been told the full truth of it. That secret would not remain buried for much longer, and when it finally surfaced, it would test not only the fragile trust between Eleanor and Alistair, but the very foundation upon which both families had built their names. The housekeeper at Rothmere, a stern and long-serving woman named Mrs. Price, was the first to voice her unease, though she did so carefully, choosing her moment with the caution of someone who understood exactly how much power lay behind a duke's displeasure. She waited until an evening when Alistair sat alone in the library, a glass of unfinished brandy at his elbow, and Eleanor's name still lingering, unspoken but present, in the air around him. "Your Grace," she began, "forgive me for speaking plainly, but I served your uncle for 30 years, and I would be failing in my duty if I did not tell you what I know." Alistair set down his glass. "Say it then." "The Ashworth name is not unknown to this house," Mrs. Price said. "Your uncle once loved a woman named Marguerite Ashworth." Sir Reginald's own sister. It was a love the family did not approve, and when it ended, badly, and not by your uncle's choice, the Ashworth fortunes began their decline not long after. Some believed it was no coincidence. The words settled into the room like smoke, slow and suffocating. Alistair sat very still. "You are suggesting my uncle ruined them, deliberately." "I am suggesting," Mrs. Price said carefully, "that there are debts in this world that are not measured in coin, Your Grace, and that your uncle may have collected on one, long after the woman who inspired it was gone." Alistair did not sleep that night. He turned the housekeeper's words over and over, searching for a version of the story that did not implicate the family name he had so recently inherited. But the more he searched his uncle's old ledgers and correspondence, hidden away in a locked drawer of the estate office, the more the outline of a darker truth began to emerge. There, in his uncle's hand, were records of investments quietly withdrawn from ventures Sir Reginald Ashworth had trusted, timed with a precision that could not be mistaken for coincidence. There were letters, too, written in a bitterness that had clearly outlived whatever love had once existed, promising in coded language to see the Ashworth name brought low enough to remember its place. Alistair closed the ledger with hands that were not entirely steady. He understood now that his courtship of Eleanor Ashworth had begun in innocence, but that it was unfolding inside the wreckage of a cruelty his own family had authored. The question that kept him awake was not whether he should tell her. It was whether telling her would cost him the only honest thing he had built since inheriting a title he had never wanted. He did not tell her, not yet, and that single, cowardly silence would become the first crack in a foundation that had seemed, only weeks before, unshakable. Meanwhile, in the modest stone house at Marlow Fen, Eleanor faced a crisis of her own, one that had nothing to do with buried scandal and everything to do with the present. Thomas's cough, which had worsened through the winter, returned with a violence that frightened her in a way his childhood illnesses never had. The village physician, summoned at an expense the family could barely manage, spoke in the careful, evasive language physicians use when they do not wish to say the word that frightens everyone most. Consumption, he called it eventually, when pressed, and recommended warmer climates, better nourishment, medicines that cost more than the Ashworth household saw in a month. Sir Reginald, desperate and humiliated in equal measure, did something Eleanor would not learn of until much later. He wrote to the Duke of Rothmere directly, not as a prospective father-in-law offering pleasantries, but as a drowning man reaching for the nearest hand, however undignified the reaching. He asked, plainly, for a loan against the hope of Eleanor's eventual marriage into the family, a gesture so nakedly transactional that Eleanor would have been mortified to know of it. Alistair received the letter on the same evening he had closed his uncle's ledger, and the timing struck him as almost unbearably cruel. Here was Sir Reginald, unknowingly asking the nephew of his family's destroyer for the very money that might save his son's life. Alistair sat with the letter for a long time, torn between the guilt now settled permanently in his chest and the simple, human urge to help a family in genuine crisis. In the end, he sent the money, quietly, generously, without condition, but he did not tell Eleanor where it had come from, allowing Sir Reginald to present it to his daughter as a gift from an anonymous benefactor moved by Thomas's plight. It was, Alistair told himself, an act of kindness. In truth, it was the second brick laid in a wall of secrecy that would eventually collapse on all of them at once. Thomas's health improved through the following months, the warmer air and better medicine doing precisely what the physician had hoped, and Eleanor's gratitude toward this unknown benefactor mingled, without her realizing it, with her growing feelings for Alistair, as though some part of her sensed a connection she could not yet name. She continued to visit Rothmere, continued to walk its gardens with Alistair at her side, and slowly, carefully, allowed herself to believe that whatever the future held, it might not be as bleak as the years behind her had suggested. But secrets, once planted, rarely stay buried. And the person who would eventually unearth this one was not Alistair nor Eleanor, but a woman neither of them yet suspected, Lady Caroline Fenwick, a distant cousin of the late Duke, who arrived at Rothmere that autumn with ambitions of her own regarding Alistair's hand, and a memory sharp enough to recall exactly what had happened to Marguerite Ashworth 11 years before. Lady Caroline arrived at Rothmere on a bright October afternoon, her carriage announced with the particular fanfare of a woman who had long practiced the art of making entrances feel like events. She was handsome in the sharp, angular way that photographed well in portraiture, but rarely translated into warmth, and she had spent the better part of the last decade cultivating a friendship with the late Duke's sister, specifically so that she might, eventually, position herself near whatever fortune the Rothmere line eventually produced. Alistair's unexpected inheritance had accelerated her plans considerably, and Eleanor Ashworth's growing presence in his life was, to Lady Caroline, an obstacle to be removed rather than a rival to be respected. She wasted no time in seeking out Mrs. Price, whom she had known since childhood visits to the estate, and within a single conversation over tea, extracted the same story the housekeeper had reluctantly given Alistair weeks before. Lady Caroline listened with the particular stillness of a predator recognizing an opportunity, and when Mrs. Price finished, Caroline set down her teacup with deliberate care. "How extraordinary," she said, "that the current Duke should be courting the niece of the very woman his uncle destroyed." "His Grace does not speak of it," Mrs. Price said carefully. "I believe he wishes it forgotten. Some things," Lady Caroline replied, "are far too useful to forget." She did not act immediately. Caroline was, if nothing else, a patient woman, and she understood that information wielded too early loses its power. Instead, she inserted herself gradually into the social orbit of both households, attending the same church services, arranging to be present at the same assemblies, cultivating a friendly acquaintance with Eleanor herself, that Eleanor, lacking any reason for suspicion, accepted at face value. It was during one of these carefully engineered conversations, held in the modest parlour of Ashworth's stone house, over tea Eleanor could scarcely afford to serve, that Lady Caroline first planted the seed that would eventually grow into catastrophe. "You know," Caroline said, with the studied casualness of someone who had rehearsed the line many times, "your family and the Rothmeres have quite a history, don't you? I'm surprised His Grace has never mentioned it." Eleanor set down her own cup, an unfamiliar unease stirring in her chest. "What history do you mean?" "Oh," Caroline said, feigning sudden discomfort, "perhaps it isn't my place. I only assumed you knew, given how close you've become." It was, of course, precisely calculated to leave Eleanor with more questions than answers, and it succeeded exactly as intended. Eleanor spent the following days turning the comment over in her mind, unable to shake the sense that something essential had been withheld from her, something that touched not only her own history, but the very foundation of her relationship with Alistair. She did not confront him immediately. Instead, she began, quietly and carefully, to ask questions of her own, of her father, of the old servants who remembered her Aunt Marguerite, of anyone who might hold a piece of the story Lady Caroline had so deliberately left incomplete. Sir Reginald, when pressed, grew evasive in a manner entirely unlike his usual openness, and his evasion told Eleanor more than any direct answer could have. There was a truth here, buried and guarded, and the fact that her own father would not speak it frightened her more than the truth itself might have. It was an old servant, Mrs. Hallow, who had once worked in the Ashworth household during Eleanor's childhood and now lived in modest retirement at the edge of the village, who finally gave Eleanor the fragments she needed. "Your Aunt Marguerite," Mrs. Hallow said, her voice softened by age and old sorrow, "was the finest woman I ever knew. She loved the old Duke, not this one, child, his uncle, with a devotion I've rarely seen matched. And he loved her too, or claimed to, until his family made plain that a woman without a title was beneath a duke's wife, whatever his heart preferred. He broke it off, cruelly, and all at once, with no warning given. Your aunt never recovered from it. She died within 2 years, of what the physicians called a wasting illness, though those of us who loved her called it heartbreak, plain and simple." Eleanor sat very still, absorbing a history she had never once been told. "And my father's fortune?" Mrs. Hallow's face tightened. "There were rumors, child, that the old Duke did not stop at breaking her heart. that he saw to it that certain investments failed, certain doors closed, as though punishing the whole family for a love he himself had ended. I cannot say if it's true. I can only say that your family's ruin began not long after Marguerite's death, and that coincidences of that particular shape rarely occur without a hand guiding them. The revelation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She understood now what Lady Caroline had so carefully implied, and she understood, too, the full weight of what it meant, that the man she had come to love, the Duke whose gentleness had begun to feel like a genuine foundation for a future, carried within his own family's history the very cruelty that had shattered her aunt and impoverished her father. Alistair himself had done nothing. She reminded herself of this, again and again, in the days that followed. But the shadow of his uncle's cruelty now lay across everything they had built together, and Eleanor could not shake the fear that history, once repeated in one generation, might find a way to repeat itself in another. She confronted him at last, on a grey afternoon in the Rothmere Gardens, the same paths where their courtship had first deepened into something real. Alistair, seeing her expression, understood immediately that the secret he had kept, first out of caution, then out of cowardice, then simply because he had not found the courage to unmake his own silence, had finally found its way to her, regardless of his efforts to control its release. "You knew," Eleanor said, before he could speak. "You knew about my aunt, about what your uncle did to my family, and you said nothing." Alistair did not attempt to deny it, and something in Eleanor almost respected him for that, even through her anger. "I learned of it shortly after our courtship began," he admitted. "I did not know how to tell you without destroying everything we had started to build. So instead, you let me discover it from someone else, someone who used it against me." "I know," Alistair said quietly. "I have regretted the silence every day since. I told myself I was protecting you. In truth, I think I was protecting myself, from watching your feelings for me change once you understood what my family had done to yours." Eleanor's anger, sharp and immediate, was tangled inseparably with a grief she had not expected. Grief for an aunt she had barely known, grief for a father whose quiet defeat now made a terrible new kind of sense, grief for the version of her own trust that had existed only moments before this conversation began. "And the money," she said suddenly, the pieces assembling themselves with sickening speed. "The gift that saved Thomas. That was you." Alistair's silence was answer enough. "You bought my gratitude," Eleanor said, her voice breaking for the first time, while hiding the very reason my family needed saving in the first place. "That is not what happened," Alistair said, urgency entering his voice for the first time. "Eleanor, please believe me. I never intended." "Intention does not undo consequence," Eleanor said, and she turned from him then, walking the garden path back toward the house with a composure that cost her everything she had left to give. It would be many weeks before they spoke again, weeks in which the county's gossip machinery churned with fresh and vicious energy, fed generously by Lady Caroline Fenwick, who had achieved exactly the fracture she had engineered, and now moved to press her advantage before either Eleanor or Alistair could repair what had broken between them. Lady Caroline's campaign, once begun, proved relentless. She called upon Eleanor with feigned sympathy, expressing sorrow over such a painful discovery, while subtly reinforcing every worst interpretation of Alistair's silence. She called upon Alistair with an entirely different strategy, positioning herself as the sensible alternative, a woman of appropriate rank who would never embarrass him with scandal or complication, unlike the Ashworth girl whose family history had proven so inconveniently entangled with his own. She was careful, always, to appear as a friend to both parties, even as she worked steadily to widen the distance between them. And for a time, her strategy seemed to be succeeding. Sir Reginald, for his part, was devastated to learn the truth of what had happened to his sister, and devastated further by the realization that his own desperate letter to Alistair had unknowingly deepened a debt of guilt the young Duke already carried. He said as much to Eleanor one evening, his voice heavy with a shame that had clearly been building for weeks. "I should have told you about Marguerite years ago," he admitted. "I thought silence would protect you from a grief that was mine to carry. not yours to inherit. I see now that I only delayed the pain and made it crueler when it finally arrived. You are not the one who owes me an explanation, Father, Eleanor said, though her voice carried more weariness than anger by this point. I only wish someone, anyone, had trusted me with the truth before I was forced to assemble it from whispers and half-confessions. It was during this period of estrangement that Alistair, driven by a guilt he could no longer bear silently, undertook an investigation of his own, not to defend himself, but to understand fully what his uncle had done, in the hope that complete honesty, however painful, might be the only path back to Eleanor's trust. What he discovered exceeded even the darkest rumors Mrs. Hallow had shared. His uncle, it emerged through further ledgers and a cache of private correspondence discovered in a locked chest in the estate's old study, had not merely withdrawn investments from Sir Reginald's ventures. He had actively conspired with a rival merchant to spread false rumors of Sir Reginald's financial instability, rumors that caused legitimate creditors to withdraw their support and legitimate partners to sever their arrangements, creating the very ruin that then became self-fulfilling. It was, in the coldest possible sense, a deliberate and calculated destruction of an entire family, undertaken not in a moment of passion, but across a sustained campaign of months, all because a young woman without title had dared to love a duke who could not, in the end, defy his family's expectations. Alistair found, too, a final letter, never sent, written by his uncle in the last years of his life, in which the old duke confessed, to no one, in the privacy of paper he never intended anyone to read, that destroying the Ashworth family had brought him no peace, only a hollow satisfaction that curdled, over the years, into something indistinguishable from regret. I have made myself into the very cruelty I told myself I was avoiding, the letter read, in words that struck Alistair with the force of prophecy, and I fear the debt of it will not end with me. He was right. The debt had not ended. It had simply waited, patiently, for the next generation to inherit it. Alistair brought this evidence to Eleanor himself, travelling to Marlow Fen, despite the coldness with which he knew he might be received, because he understood, finally, that partial honesty had cost him everything, and that only complete honesty offered any hope of repair. He found her in the modest garden behind the stone house, tending to the last of the autumn roses, with the careful attention of a woman who found comfort in small, controllable tasks, when larger matters felt unmanageable. I have brought you the truth, he said, without preamble, extending the small collection of letters and ledgers he had gathered. All of it, not the fragments Lady Caroline chose to share, but everything, exactly as it happened. I should have brought it to you the day I first learned it. I am sorry beyond what words can properly carry that I did not. Eleanor took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, and read them in the fading afternoon light, while Alistair stood silently at a respectful distance, offering no defense, no interruption, only the patience of a man prepared to accept whatever judgment followed. When she finished, her eyes were wet, though her voice remained steady. This is worse than I imagined, she said quietly, and yet somehow easier to bear, knowing it in full, than living with the fragments I had assembled on my own. I do not ask you to forgive my uncle, Alistair said. I do not entirely expect you to forgive me either for the silence I kept. I ask only that you know I am not seeking to hide anything further from you. Whatever comes next, I want it built on truth, even if that truth costs me everything. It was, perhaps, the moment when reconciliation might have been possible, had Lady Caroline Fenwick not chosen precisely this juncture to deploy the final and most damaging piece of her scheme, one that would transform a private grief into a public catastrophe, and force Alistair into the very ultimatum that would eventually send Eleanor walking into the rain. Lady Caroline, sensing that her carefully cultivated fracture between Eleanor and Alistair was in danger of healing, moved with the ruthlessness of a woman who understood that half measures rarely succeeded against genuine affection. She arranged, through a network of acquaintances cultivated specifically for such purposes, to have the story of Marguerite Ashworth's ruin along with a carefully distorted account of Alistair's secret payments to the Ashworth family, published in a manner calculated to reach every drawing room in the county within a matter of days. The account, as it spread, transformed Alistair's quiet act of kindness toward Thomas's illness into something far uglier. The suggestion that he had been buying Eleanor's affection, perhaps even her father's complicity in arranging a match, using guilt money extracted from his own family's crimes. The scandal that erupted was immediate and merciless. Eleanor found herself the subject of open speculation at every gathering she attended, whispered about as a woman who had either been cruelly deceived or, in the crueler version of the story, favored by those who envied her sudden proximity to a duke, as a calculating opportunist who had known all along and simply waited for the most advantageous moment to extract her price. Sir Reginald, already fragile from the revelation of his sister's fate, found himself facing renewed pressure from creditors who now questioned whether his daughter's connection to the Rothmere fortune was as secure as it had once seemed, and whether the family's debts might, after all, go unpaid. It was into this maelstrom that the Dowager Duchess of Rothmere, Alistair's own grandmother, a woman of formidable will who had watched the scandal unfold with mounting alarm, inserted herself, summoning Alistair to a private audience that would prove to be the turning point of the entire story. "You must end this connection," the Dowager Duchess said, without preamble, when Alistair arrived at her chambers. "Immediately, and publicly, before the scandal attaches itself permanently to the Rothmere name." "I will not abandon her," Alistair said. "Not now, when she has done nothing to deserve this, and everything to endure it with more grace than the situation warrants." "Then you will ruin this family a second time," the Dowager Duchess replied, her voice hard with the particular coldness of aristocratic self-preservation. "You will confirm every whisper that the Rothmere line preys upon vulnerable families for its own amusement. The estate's tenants, its creditors, its standing among the peerage, all of it depends upon you severing this connection now, cleanly, and marrying appropriately before the damage becomes permanent." Alistair argued, but the Dowager Duchess held considerable influence over the estate's finances during this transitional period of his inheritance, and she made plain, in terms that left no ambiguity, that his continued association with Eleanor would result in consequences reaching far beyond his own personal happiness, consequences that would fall upon tenants who depended on the estate's stability, upon servants whose livelihoods hung on the family's reputation, upon distant relations whose own prospects were tied, however indirectly, to the Rothmere name remaining untarnished. It was under this crushing weight of obligation, guilt, and genuine uncertainty about what course might cause the least harm to the most people that Alistair arrived at the decision that would bring the story full circle to the scene with which it began, the rain-soaked portico, the ultimatum delivered in a voice that no longer sounded entirely like his own, and Eleanor's quiet, devastating refusal to be placed on either side of a scale not of her making. He arrived at Ashworth's stone house on an afternoon heavy with the promise of storm, and found Eleanor in the garden once more, though this time there were no roses left to tend, only the bare stems of a season already turning toward winter. "I have come," Alistair said, "because I can see no path forward that does not require an impossible choice, and I would rather ask it of you directly than watch us both be destroyed slowly by everyone else's expectations." "Then ask it," Eleanor said, though something in her voice suggested she already understood what was coming. "My grandmother insists that our connection must end, for the sake of the estate, its tenants, its very survival," Alistair said. "I do not agree with her reasoning entirely, but I cannot deny that the consequences she describes are real, and that people beyond ourselves will suffer if I ignore them. I am asking you," he paused, and even now, Eleanor could see how much the words cost him. "I am asking you to choose. Choose me, and accept that it may mean estrangement from your father, whose desperate letter to me is now part of the very scandal destroying us both, and whose continued financial entanglement with my family will only feed further rumor. Or choose your family, and release me from an obligation I no longer have the strength to defend against every voice insisting I abandon it. The rain began then, slow at first, gathering weight as it fell, and Eleanor stood beneath the darkening sky with a clarity that surprised even her. "You are asking me to become a woman I do not recognize," she said, the words arriving with the same steadiness that would carry her through the moment that had opened this very story. "I will not do it, not for you, not for anyone." "Then you choose them," Alistair said, disbelief and something like desperation entering his voice. "You choose your father's ruin over the future I am offering you." "I choose neither," Eleanor said. "I am not a piece to be placed on one side of a scale or the other." And she turned and walked into the rain, leaving Alistair standing beneath the portico with an ultimatum that had failed to produce the choice he had so desperately needed someone else to make for him. What neither of them yet understood was that Eleanor's refusal, her quiet, radical insistence on choosing neither path laid before her, would become the very thing that unraveled the scandal entirely, exposing not only Lady Caroline Fenwick's manipulations, but a deeper truth about the old Duke's crimes that even Alistair had not yet fully uncovered. That reckoning was still to come, and it would arrive from a direction none of them expected. In the days following her walk through the rain, Eleanor did something that surprised her father, surprised the county, and surprised most of all herself. She did not retreat into grief or wait passively for the scandal to run its course. Instead, she began quietly gathering her own evidence, determined that if her family's ruin and her aunt's heartbreak were to be picked apart in every drawing room in the county, they would at least be picked apart with the truth, rather than Lady Caroline's careful distortions. She wrote to the merchant houses her father had once dealt with, seeking records of the rumors that had spread against him 11 years before. She wrote to solicitors who had handled Marguerite's modest estate after her death, requesting any correspondence that might clarify exactly how the old Duke's cruelty had been executed. And she wrote, finally, to a name Mrs. Hallow had mentioned only in passing, a former steward of the Rothmere estate named Josiah Fenn, dismissed under circumstances no one seemed willing to fully explain, who was rumored to still live in modest retirement 2 counties away. Josiah Fenn responded within a fortnight, and his letter, when it arrived, changed the entire shape of the story. He had been steward to the old Duke during the very period when Marguerite Ashworth's ruin was engineered, and he confirmed, in painstaking and damning detail, not only the old Duke's role in destroying Sir Reginald's fortune, but something far more explosive. That Lady Caroline Fenwick herself, then a young woman newly introduced into the old Duke's social circle, had been the one to first suggest the scheme, hoping to eliminate Marguerite as a romantic rival for her own ambitions toward the old Duke's affection. Ambitions that had failed then, just as her current scheme against Eleanor was failing now. Caroline had orchestrated cruelty once before, against Eleanor's own aunt, and had returned, more than a decade later, to attempt precisely the same destruction against the niece. This revelation, once confirmed and corroborated by additional correspondence Eleanor's solicitor uncovered in the following weeks, transformed the scandal entirely. It was no longer a story of a duke's family preying upon a vulnerable one, but a story of a single woman's decade-spanning campaign of manipulation, first against Marguerite and now against Eleanor, motivated by an ambition for status that had curdled, over the years, into something closer to obsession. When the truth became known, carefully and deliberately released by Eleanor herself, through channels designed to ensure it could not be dismissed as mere gossip, the county's sympathy reversed with the same speed and cruelty that had originally condemned her. Lady Caroline Fenwick, exposed and disgraced, withdrew from society within weeks, her ambitions toward the Rothmere fortune permanently extinguished, her reputation ruined by precisely the mechanism she had once wielded so effectively against others. Alistair, confronted with the full truth of his uncle's crimes and Caroline's role in both generations of cruelty, went to his grandmother with an ultimatum of his own, one that finally forced the Dowager Duchess to acknowledge that the estate's true reputation had never been endangered by Eleanor Ashworth, but by the family's own long history of quiet, calculated harm, now finally dragged into the light, where it could no longer be denied. But even as the scandal resolved itself in Eleanor's favour, and even as Alistair arrived once more at the stone house at Marlow Fen, this time not with an ultimatum, but with an apology that finally matched the scale of everything he had failed to say before, Eleanor found that something fundamental within her had shifted during the weeks she had spent walking alone through the rain of her own making. She was no longer certain that returning to the life she had once imagined, the life of a duke's wife, safely folded back into the very world that had so recently tried to destroy her, was the future she wanted at all. Alistair found her, once again, in the garden, though this time the bare rose stems had begun to show the first small buds of a spring no one had quite expected to arrive so gently after such a violent winter of revelation. "The truth is known," Alistair said. "Caroline is disgraced. My grandmother has withdrawn her objection. There is nothing standing between us any longer, except whatever remains of the harm I caused by my silence." Eleanor considered him for a long moment before answering. "You are right that nothing stands between us any longer," she said. "But I find that I am no longer the woman who needs a duke to complete her life, Alistair. I spent 3 years believing my worth depended on the fortunes of men. My father's failing investments, your family's cruelty, even your own kindness, which I now understand came tangled with guilt I never asked you to carry. I do not wish to build a marriage on the ashes of that dependency, however sincerely you might now offer it." "Then what do you wish to build?" Alistair asked, and there was no anger in the question, only a genuine, humbled curiosity. "I do not entirely know yet," Eleanor admitted, "but I intend to find out, on my own terms, before I allow myself to be folded into anyone else's story again, not my father's, not Lady Caroline's, and not yours, however differently intended." It was not, in the end, a final refusal. Eleanor did not close the door on Alistair entirely, understanding that genuine change, in him and in herself, could not be measured in a single conversation, however honest. Instead, she asked for time to rebuild her father's household on foundations of her own choosing, time to establish, with the modest settlement, the truth of Marguerite's ruin had finally secured from the Rothmere estate as rightful compensation, a measure of independence she had never before possessed, time to discover whether the affection she still undeniably felt for Alistair could grow into something sturdier than the desperate, guilt-laden entanglement it had first been. Alistair, to his credit, did not press her. He returned to Rothmere and set about the slow, unglamorous work of reforming an estate built partly on inherited cruelty, releasing tenants from arrangements his uncle had structured punitively, establishing a fund, quietly, without the fanfare that might have suggested performance rather than genuine repair, to support families the old Duke's schemes had damaged, including, discreetly, support offered to Josiah Fenn's own household in gratitude for the steward's courage in finally speaking the truth. Eleanor, meanwhile, used the settlement to secure Thomas's continued care, to see her father's remaining debts finally cleared, and to establish herself, for the first time in her adult life, as a woman whose choices were not dictated by the desperate arithmetic of survival. She began to write, letters at first, then longer reflections, eventually a modest correspondence with several other women of reduced circumstance across the county, sharing practical guidance on managing household affairs with dignity, despite diminished means, a small network of mutual support that would, in later years, grow into something considerably larger than anyone might have predicted from its humble beginnings. It was nearly a year after that first rain-soaked refusal that Alistair returned to Marlow Fen one final time, not with an ultimatum, not even with a formal proposal delivered on bent knee, but simply with a request to walk with Eleanor through the garden one more time, as they had so many times before everything had fractured, and, slowly, painstakingly, begun to heal. "I am not the same man who stood beneath that portico and asked you to choose," Alistair said, as they walked. "I understand now that the choice I demanded was never truly about you and your family. It was about my own fear of standing against expectations I had never questioned. You taught me, without intending to, that refusing an impossible choice is sometimes the only honest answer available. And I am not the same woman who might have accepted whatever future you offered, simply because it promised safety, Eleanor replied. I have learned that my own choices, however smaller and slower they might seem, beside a duke's fortune, are worth more to me than any security offered at the cost of my own voice. Then what remains between us? Alistair asked. If not the old arrangement, and not the old dependency? Eleanor considered the question seriously, walking in silence for several long moments before answering. Perhaps, she said finally, a friendship built on truth, allowed to become whatever it becomes, without either of us demanding in advance what shape it must take. It was, in its own quiet way, a more honest foundation than the desperate courtship that had first drawn them together. And in the months that followed, that foundation proved sturdier than either of them might have predicted. Alistair continued his work, reforming the estate, visiting Marlow Fen not as a suitor demanding resolution, but as a man genuinely interested in the woman Eleanor was becoming. Eleanor, in turn, allowed herself, slowly and without the old desperation, to imagine a future that might eventually include him, not as an escape from hardship, but as a partnership between equals, who had each, in their own way, learned the cost of choosing safety over truth. Sir Reginald, restored to a measure of his old dignity through the settlement, and, more importantly, through witnessing his daughter's quiet strength throughout the entire ordeal, lived to see Thomas grow into a healthy young man, his lungs strengthened by years of proper care, his prospects secured by the modest but stable fortune Eleanor's own resourcefulness had rebuilt. Lady Caroline Fenwick, disgraced and unwelcome in every drawing-room that had once courted her favour, withdrew to a distant relations estate in the north, her decade-spanning campaign of manipulation finally and permanently at an end, her ambition having cost her, in the final accounting, everything she had once hoped to gain. And Eleanor Ashworth, who had once stood beneath a rain-soaked portico and refused to be placed on either side of an impossible scale, became known throughout the county not as the woman who had almost married a duke, nor as the niece of a scandal decades buried, but simply as a woman who had walked away from an ultimatum and, in doing so, discovered a version of herself far sturdier than anyone, including Eleanor herself, had ever imagined possible. Whether she and Alistair eventually married, whether their careful, truth-built friendship blossomed into the partnership both of them had begun to hope for, or whether Eleanor's newly discovered independence carried her toward a future entirely of her own making, separate from dukes and estates and the old entanglements of fortune and family, that final chapter belongs to a story still being written, one choice at a time, by a woman who had finally learned that the most powerful answer to an impossible choice is sometimes simply to refuse the terms on which it was offered, and walk forward into whatever reign awaits, on legs entirely her own.